Something very unusual is happening in Israel. Senior military officials have begun voicing criticism of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's conduct of the war in Gaza. Israeli media has been reporting on a weekend security meeting at which the Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, General Herzi Halevi, criticized Netanyahu's lack of a clear strategy, pointing out that the Israeli military had re-entered northern Gaza, an area it claimed to have cleared in January. He warned that unless there was a plan to set up some kind of non-Hamas government in these areas, the IDF would have to keep repeating these kinds of operations endlessly. Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, has gone further, publicly criticizing the prime minister, pointing out that the day after Hamas will only be achieved by actors who replace Hamas, and declaring that he would not permit Israel to try to govern Gaza directly. The New York Times reported on others within the Israeli military making similar criticisms. As Anshel Pfeffer writes in Haaretz, these briefings to the press have been synchronized as part as what can only be a coordinated briefing against the prime minister. The reason for these extraordinary dissents at a time of war is that Israeli officials have begun to realize what American officials have been warning them about for months, that without a strategy to create stable governance in Gaza, they will face a continuing insurgency, just as the U.S. did in Afghanistan and Iraq. There is evidence it is already happening. Israeli forces have been forced back into Jabalia twice, and they have returned 3 times to Zaytun. Their recent and controversial raid on the Al-Shifa hospital was the second effort, showing that their initial success was not lasting. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken noted last Sunday,
"We've seen in areas that Israel has cleared, in the north, even in Khan Yunis, Hamas coming back."
Much has been written about whether the Israeli military is being careful or callous in its concern for civilian casualties when conducting its attacks in Gaza. But the larger point has to do with its counterinsurgency strategy itself. In America's only successful counterinsurgency campaign in recent memory, the surge in Iraq, its strategy was designed to protect the civilian population, isolate the insurgents, and then crush them. To that end, General David Petraeus worked tirelessly with Iraq's Sunnis, the community spawning the insurgency, to win them over, give them a stake in Iraq's government, and thus isolate the insurgents and the militias. He then used lethal force against those militias. This is almost the inverse of Israel's strategy, which has been first and foremost to go after Hamas guns blazing, with very little regard for winning the hearts and minds of Gaza's civilian population. Prime Minister Netanyahu's argument against post-war plans and operations is that the war isn't over. And in his words, there is no alternative to military victory. The attempt to bypass it with this or that claim is simply detached from reality. Bibi has repeatedly said that he would continue the war until he achieves total victory, by which he presumably means either a surrender by Hamas or its total eradication. The Biden administration has from early on in the war believed that Bibi's strategy was flawed because there was no way to defeat Hamas militarily without a political strategy to isolate it and offer an alternative that had some credibility and legitimacy. That was why the Biden administration wanted to begin discussions with the Palestinian Authority and a group of Arab states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia to make plans for reconstruction and governance in a non-Hamas Gaza. Netanyahu has refused to consider any such plans. Bibi Netanyahu refuses to talk about the post-war because he knows that his own post-war future is bleak. Many Israelis continue to hold him responsible for the policies that led to the October 7th attack. Were new elections to be called, he would likely lose office and then face an ongoing prosecution as well as potential inquiries about the failures that led to October 7th. All of this can be pushed off as long as he insists on a Hamas surrender, which he will not get, but which will keep the war going on indefinitely. It is a strategy not designed to secure Israel's future, but rather his own. Go to cnn.com/Fareed for a link to my Washington Post column this week. And let's get started. So you heard what I had to say. What does a better war strategy for Israel look like? Joining me now is former CIA director and retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus, whom I mentioned in my take. He commanded American and coalition troops both in Iraq and Afghanistan. David, welcome. First, let me ask you to explain, what was the heart of your strategy in Iraq, which worked? You were battling an insurgency, a bunch of terrorists, militias, call them what you will, and the U.S. had not been able to really eradicate those terrorists. What did you do?
Well, first and foremost, we committed to making life better for innocent Iraqi civilians, and we pledged that we would get al-Qaeda, an extremist group irreconcilable, similar to Hamas, out of their midst. We would clear their neighborhoods, their cities of al-Qaeda, and then we would keep them out of those cities and neighborhoods. We'd create gated communities, 12 of them alone in Fallujah, which was already completely encircled by cement to keep them out. And then you have biometric ID cards. We would flood the area immediately with humanitarian assistance, then restore basic services, and then go about the comprehensive reconstruction, rebuilding all of the damaged infrastructure, restoring schools, markets, clinics, bridges, roads that had been blown up by al-Qaeda and by the other of the most dangerous Sunni insurgent groups. And then keep the pressure on those groups, constantly going after them after having cleared comprehensively from the populated areas. But the key was the hold and the build. We're seeing in Gaza the clearing. The problem is if you don't hold, again, keep the people separate from, in this case, Hamas, which is, again, an extremist group akin to the Islamic State. It's irreconcilable. But if you don't separate them from the population and keep them separate, you're going to have to go back and re-clear, because extremist groups, if they're not kept out, will reconstitute. We saw it ultimately at the end of the 3.5-year period after the surge, which drove violence down by nearly 90%, and it continued to go down even as we drew down in the subsequent 3.5 years until the withdrawal of our final combat forces and Prime Minister Maliki taking highly sectarian actions that took his security forces' eyes off the Islamic State. They were able to reconstitute, and of course within 2 years you had the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria. Look, I want to see Israel succeed. I believe Hamas does need to be destroyed. What they did on October 7th was absolutely barbaric and horrific and unspeakable. And it's an example that you've got to get them out of control of the people and out of the governance of Gaza. And obviously there has to be then some kind of vision for what the future will be. And of course, it's interesting to see the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and then also the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces calling for the establishment of a vision for a midterm and then a longer term, because if you don't know where you're going, as they say, any road will take you there.